somewhere beyond the sea, somewhere waiting for me.
Alright, we are on lesson 2 on classifying rational numbers. So in order for us to classify a rational number, we have to know what is a rational number. So we're going to go through and describe what a rational number is. But in addition to that, we're also going to go through and describe, again, we're going to review what an integer is. And then we're going to talk about a whole number. I know you guys may know what a whole number is, but we're going to talk specifically in algebra what that refers to. And then something called a natural number we're also going to talk about. And we're going to look at some charts and things on how to classify these. So to start, a rational number is any number that can be written in the form a over b, where a and b are integers and b is not equal to 0. So it's important that a and b are both integers, and we're going to, again, to redefine what that means here in a minute. But b cannot be equal to 0 because you cannot divide by 0. It's important to remember that it's impossible to divide something across 0 groups. So when you think about division, division is really when you're saying, okay, I have so many objects and I'm dividing across this many number of groups. Well, you can't divide it among 0 groups. That's impossible. So you can't divide by 0, so the denominator in a fraction can never be 0. Otherwise, what this is saying is it's just a fraction, is all that means. Now, an integer, remember, is any number found on a standard number line. And so again, that means both positive and negative numbers, and that's going to be anything like 25, negative 623, no decimals, so integers are just any number found on a standard number line. Now a whole number would be all positive integers and 0. So it's 0 and all positive integers. So starting with 0 and then going up the whole way to infinity. So it just it cuts off all those negatives. And then natural numbers, the only difference between a whole number and a natural number is that a natural number is just all positive integers. It does not include 0. So the only difference between whole numbers and natural numbers is the number 0. When you include 0, it's a whole number. If 0 is not included, it's natural numbers. So again, just some classifications and definitions there of different types of numbers that we just haven't talked about in the past. And so these are all just going to be a little just more detailed than maybe what you're used to. But we are going to go through and classify what these numbers look like and what they mean. And we're also going to give each of them a letter representation on how to simplify instead of writing rational in integers and so on and so forth. So I'm going to go ahead and give you a chart that we're going to use to classify these numbers. And so really it just kind of starts with a big square, or a big rectangle. And this represents all rational numbers. And rational numbers are these I should really say, let me redo that. This is going to be And this isn't going to mean anything to you until you get into Algebra 2 and other things later. But really, this whole box should represent what we would call real numbers. Eventually down the road, we represent those with the letter R. Down the road, you're going to talk about something called imaginary numbers. And again, I'm not even going to try to explain them now, but you will get into something called imaginary numbers one day. So right now, we're just talking within that box of real numbers. So then inside there, we would have all of these things. So we're going to have really most of this box is going to be contained with rational numbers, with just a few things on the outside. In rational numbers, we use the letter Q. So if something can be labeled a rational number, we put it in the group Q. And so Q represents all the numbers that are rational. And then we go down to integers. Integers are the next things, because rationals are all decimals, terminating decimals, fractions, all of those things. So then when we isolate that just a little bit more, and we go down one more grouping, those would be the integers. So integers exclude all of the numbers out here, and these are Z. Okay? Now don't ask me where some of these things come from. I think there's Latin roots in there that are where some of these came from. But real numbers are just all numbers for now. Rational, this could include like 1/2, -3/4. It could be 5/9, those things. Integers are now included, so now we're just looking at -2, -3, 5, so on and so forth. Then we isolate this a little bit more, and we're into what we call whole numbers. And that is a W, so that makes sense. Remember, that includes 0, but then it's just all positive. So 1, 2, 3, so on and so forth. Then the smallest grouping here in the middle is what we call natural numbers, and that's labeled with N. And that would just be all your positives. So we have 25, 37, so on and so forth. No 0 and no negatives. So it just keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And pretty much we're just isolating more and more terms as we go in there. So let me zoom in just a little bit for you here, so you can see so you can just see a little bit clearer what I wrote on the inside of that. So rational numbers are the big group, then integers are a little bit smaller, and then whole numbers are a little bit smaller, and natural are the smallest. Kind of the easiest way I can think of to say this would be fruit. Let's say, for instance, rational numbers would just be all fruit. And then integers would be just your citrus fruits. So those would include all of your pineapples, your oranges, your lemons, your limes, your grapefruit, all of those things. So the big group there is fruit. Then you classify it a little bit more and you go down to citrus fruit. Then you go down and you say, okay, maybe my yellow citrus fruit. So that would be your lemons, your pineapples, and then you go down a little bit more and you say just lemons, and so that's, it's really isolating it into just those specific types of fruits. And so that's kind of what's going on here, is that we're looking at just isolating and narrowing down group by group by group. And so what we're going to do now is go ahead and we're going to label numbers. So they're going to give us numbers, and we're going to have to label these numbers with those letters. So it's going to be important that eventually you will have to memorize those letters between the R, the Q, the Z, the N, and the W. So we took a look at this. If I have example number 1 here. So let's say they want us to classify these as within those groupings. And let's say I had a -1/2. It's a fraction, and we're going to ignore the real for now. We don't have to worry about the real. So we're just looking at Q, which is rational, Z, which is integer, W, which is whole, and N, which is natural. We're just going to look at those 4-letter groupings. So this is a fraction, which means it is indeed a Q. Okay, so it can be labeled as a rational number. However, is it an integer? It is not, because it's not found on the number line. So the only classification this gets is Q, because it's not an integer. And if it's not an integer, that means it can't be a whole number. And if it's not a whole number, it can't be a natural number. So it kind of works its way out. So let's say, for instance, now we have 15. Well, 15 can be written as a fraction, because remember, any whole number can really be written over 1. Okay? So since it can be written as a fraction, it's a rational number. It's found on the number line, so it's an integer. It's a positive whole number, so it is a whole number, and it's positive, which means that it's a natural number. So it's actually all 4 groups. It's found right there in the middle, so it's considered to be a part of all 4 groups. So take a minute. If I give you these 2 numbers, tell me which group or groups they would fall under. So go ahead and label those using 1, 2, 3, or all 4 of those letters. Sorry if I'm in your picture there for a minute. Alright, so let's take a look. I'll go ahead and give you answers for this now. 7/3, it can be written as a fraction, so we know it's Q. But is it an integer? It is not, so it's actually just rational, it's just a Q. And then what about -23? Again, any whole number can be written over 1, so it is rational. It's a whole number. I mean, it's found on the number line, so I don't want to say whole number because it's not that. So it is an integer, but it's negative, so it's not a whole number. If it's not a whole number, it's not a natural number. So it is just Q and Z. So I hope that makes a little bit of sense as to how we're going to classify those numbers and what that looks like and what that means. Okay, the last thing here that, and again this is going to be a little bit review, but the last thing here that I just want to make sure that we all are up on is the last section we took and we wrote fractions as decimals, but now we want to take decimals and write them as fractions and know that we can do that. So again, what's going to have to happen here, so we'll just kind of go over an example or two. So if I gave us 0.61, and I said write that as a fraction, remember that this is 61 hundredths, so that means it would be 61 over 100. Okay, so that part's as easy as that. I know you guys could know how to do that piece of it. The difficulty here now comes from wanting to write repeating decimals, which I think I'm actually going to save that for another time. So actually the only other thing I'm going to show you here is how to write mixed numbers, so on and so forth. So remember that if we had, for instance, 9.75, that's 9 and 75 hundredths. So you write that as 9, 75 over 100. And always simplify if you can. we know that would be 9 3/4. So I'm going to change this a little bit, so just kind of keep those sorts of things in mind. But the writing or repeating decimal as a fraction, we're going to actually hold off on and talk about that at another time. Alright, so that is this lesson. That is the main piece of classifying these numbers. That's really what I need you to take away from this, is just understanding those 4 different classifications and how those all fit together.